The coffee had gone cold in my hands, but I held on to the mug anyway. Something about the weight of it, the familiar chip on the handle that Margaret had refused to throw away for 23 years, kept me anchored to the kitchen chair. Outside, the October morning light filtered through the blinds, cutting golden stripes across the oak table where she used to spread her crossword puzzles, humming show tunes from musicals I'd never heard of. 3 years. That's how long it had been since I'd heard that humming. 3 years since I'd watched her hands move across the newspaper, pencil tapping against her bottom lip when she got stuck on 7 Down. The house still smelled faintly of her lavender soap in the upstairs bathroom, though I'd stopped going in there except to dust her vanity once a month. Some things you preserve not because you have to, but because forgetting feels like betrayal. I'd built this house with my own hands in 1987, when David was 12 and Margaret was pregnant with the baby we lost that winter. Every beam, every window frame, every piece of crown molding had been measured twice and cut once, the way my father taught me before the cancer took him. Back then, David would stand in the doorway of the garage, watching me sand cabinet doors on Saturday mornings, asking questions about grain direction and wood stain like they were the most important mysteries in the world. "Dad, why do you always check the corners twice?" he'd asked once, maybe 13 years old, sawdust in his dark hair. "Because corners tell the truth," I'd told him, running my thumb along a perfect joint. "You can hide a lot of mistakes in the middle, but corners don't lie." Now, sitting at the table we'd eaten 10,000 meals on, I wondered when my son had learned to hide things in the middle. The phone rang, cutting through the morning quiet. David's name on the caller ID made something twist in my chest. Not hope exactly, but the ghost of it. We hadn't spoken in 2 weeks, not since the awkward dinner at his house where I'd sat between his wife Claire and her mother, listening to them discuss vacation homes in the Hamptons like I wasn't there. "Dad?" His voice was different this morning, careful, like he was reading from notes. "David, I wanted to call about Mom's birthday next week." The words came out rushed, practiced. Claire and I were thinking maybe we could do something at our place, small gathering, just family. Margaret's birthday. 71 years old, if she'd lived to see it. I'd been dreading the date for months, the way you dread stepping on a bruise. "What did you have in mind?" I asked, though something in his tone already had me wary. "Nothing fancy. Claire's making her famous pot roast. We thought maybe you could bring that bottle of whiskey, the good stuff you've been saving, the Macallan 25. He paused. "Mom always said you were saving it for something special." My hand tightened on the phone. The Macallan sat in my study, still in its wooden box, still wrapped in the tissue paper Margaret had folded around it, the Christmas before she got sick. She'd saved for 8 months to buy it, working extra shifts at the hospital where she volunteered, keeping the receipt in her jewelry box like a secret. "For your retirement party," she'd whispered, kissing my cheek that Christmas morning, "when you're ready to sit on the porch and tell stories instead of building them." I'd never opened it. Retirement had come and gone without ceremony, and the stories I wanted to tell were all about her. "I'll think about it," I said. "Actually, Dad, there's something else." David's voice shifted, became more careful. "Claire's parents will be there, and her brother's family. We thought it might be nice to make it a bigger celebration, really honor Mom's memory." Claire's parents, Gerald and Patricia Morse, who'd made it clear at Margaret's funeral that they considered our modest Cape Cod house charming in the same tone you'd use to describe a stray dog. Her brother Rick, who sold commercial real estate and talked about square footage the way other men talked about baseball. These weren't people who'd known Margaret, who'd sat with her during chemo treatments or held her hand through the worst nights. "Since when is my wife's birthday about honoring her memory with your in-laws?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended. "Dad, come on, they're family now. And it would mean a lot to Claire if what?" A long pause. In the background I could hear voices, muffled conversation that sounded like coaching. "If you'd bring the bottle, the whiskey, and maybe some of Mom's jewelry, Claire thought her grandmother's pearls would be beautiful for the toast." The pearls. Margaret's grandmother's pearls, the ones she'd worn to our wedding, the ones she'd promised to save for David's wife someday. I'd put them in the safe after the funeral, along with her rings and the small diamond earrings I'd given her for our 20th anniversary. Why would Claire need the pearls for a toast? "Well, we thought, she's been taken care of so much since Mom passed. the family dinners, the holidays. She wants to feel connected to Mom's memory. Connected to Mom's memory. As if 3 years of marriage to my son had given her claim to 37 years of my wife's life. As if caring for David, which seemed to involve mostly spending money he didn't have, was the same as caring for the woman who'd raised him. "I'll see what I can do," I said, and hung up before he could say anything else. The house felt smaller after that call, like the walls had shifted inward while I wasn't paying attention. I walked through the rooms Margaret and I had planned together, the living room with its brick fireplace, the dining room where we'd hosted every Christmas, the study where she'd balanced our checkbook, and I'd drawn plans for the deck we never got to finish. In the study, the Macallan sat in its place of honor, on the bookshelf, between Margaret's nursing school textbooks and the photo albums she'd organized by year. I lifted the wooden box, feeling its weight. 25 years old, like our marriage had been when she bought it. A quarter-century of patience and craftsmanship, waiting for the right moment. I thought about Claire's careful request for the pearls, David's rehearsed words about honoring memory. There was something underneath it all, some current I couldn't quite name. The way David had sounded when he mentioned the bottle, like he was asking for more than whiskey. The way he'd brought up Claire's family, as if their presence would somehow legitimize whatever this gathering was really about. 3 hours later, I was loading the truck with the bottle and a small jewelry box containing the pearls. Not because I believed in their sudden devotion to Margaret's memory, but because I wanted to see what they were really after. In construction, you learn to trust your instincts about weak foundations. Something about this whole evening felt shaky, built on ground that wouldn't hold. David's house sat in one of those neighborhoods where the lawns looked painted green and every mailbox matched. Claire had insisted on the place 2 years ago, stretching their budget for an address that impressed people they barely knew. I'd offered to help with the down payment, thinking it would give my son stability. Now, pulling into the circular driveway behind a BMW I didn't recognize, I wondered if I'd just funded their ability to keep me at arm's length. Claire answered the door in a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, pearls already draped around her neck. Not Margaret's pearls. These were larger, newer, the kind you buy to make a statement rather than mark an occasion. "Richard," she air-kissed me on both cheeks, a habit she'd picked up somewhere that made me feel like a stranger in a play I hadn't auditioned for. "You look wonderful. David's in the kitchen with Dad, talking business." Gerald Morse's idea of business usually involved explaining why everyone else was handling their money wrong. I followed Claire through the foyer, past furniture that looked expensive and uncomfortable, toward the sound of male voices and clinking glass. The kitchen opened into a great room that could have held my entire downstairs. David stood near a granite island, holding a rocks glass filled with amber liquid, nodding, while Gerald gestured with his own drink. When he saw me, David's face brightened with the kind of smile he'd perfected in high school, right before asking for car keys or college money. "Dad, perfect timing. Gerald was just telling me about an investment opportunity." Gerald turned, extending his hand with the practiced grip of a man who'd learned to close deals over cocktails. "Richard, good to see you again. Beautiful evening for a celebration." I shook his hand, noting the weight of his watch, the cut of his suit. Gerald Morse dressed like money, talked like money, and had a way of making you feel poor just by standing next to him. Behind him, Patricia emerged from what looked like a powder room, wearing a smile as carefully applied as her lipstick. "Richard, dear, how are you holding up? Such a difficult time, losing a spouse." She touched my arm with practiced sympathy. "Gerald and I were just saying how lovely it is that David has found someone to help him through the grief. Help him through the grief. As if David's grief was somehow more significant than mine. As if losing his mother at 35 compared to losing your wife of 37 years. As if Claire's presence in his life was charity work rather than marriage. "Where's the rest of the family?" I asked, looking around the empty great room. David mentioned a gathering. "Oh, well, plans changed," Claire said quickly. "Rick and Jenny couldn't make it. Something with the kids. But we thought this would be more intimate, more meaningful. More meaningful. A dinner party for 5, where Margaret's widower sat at a table with people who'd barely known her, drinking whiskey that was supposed to celebrate her memory, while wearing her grandmother's pearls like costume jewelry. "I brought what you asked for," I said, setting the wooden box on the counter. David's eyes went to it immediately, something flickering across his face that wasn't quite gratitude. "Dad, You didn't have to. You asked me to bring it. Right, of course. He lifted the box with both hands, examining the brass clasp like he was appraising it. This is really something. Mom had good taste. Your mother saved for 8 months to buy that. She said it was for my retirement party. Well, this is better than a retirement party, Gerald said, raising his glass. This is about family, about keeping memories alive. About keeping memories alive. I watched Claire adjust Margaret's pearls around her neck, watched David trace the edges of the whiskey box with his fingertips, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't about memory. This was about possession, about claiming pieces of a life they'd never been part of, turning Margaret's treasures into props for their own story. Should we open it? David asked, already working the clasp. Start the celebration? I wanted to say no, wanted to take the box and the pearls and walk out of that gleaming kitchen, away from their careful smiles and practiced words. But something kept me rooted there, some instinct that said I needed to see this through, needed to understand what was really happening. It's your party, I said. David opened the box, revealing the bottle in its nest of tissue paper. The amber liquid caught the overhead lights, warm and rich as summer honey. Macallan 25, aged longer than David had been alive when Margaret bought it, worth more than some cars I'd owned. Gorgeous, Gerald breathed. Absolutely gorgeous. What do you think that runs retail? Dad never tells us what things cost, David said, lifting the bottle carefully. Says it ruins the magic. Smart man, Patricia said, though one does wonder about the insurance value for estate planning purposes. Estate planning purposes. The words hung in the air like smoke, acrid and obvious. I looked around the circle of faces, David's forced casualness, Claire's bright expectation, Gerald's calculating stare, Patricia's practiced concern. This wasn't a birthday celebration for my dead wife. This was an appraisal, a careful inventory of what I owned, what they wanted, and how they might go about getting it. Well, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. I suppose we should have that toast. David poured generous measures into 5 glasses, the whiskey glowing like liquid amber in the recessed lighting. When he handed me mine, our eyes met for just a moment, and I saw something there I'd never seen before. Not love, not gratitude, not even guilt. Calculation. Claire raised her glass first, Margaret's pearls catching the light at her throat. To Margaret Caldwell, a woman who clearly knew how to appreciate the finer things in life. We drank, and the whiskey burned smooth and sweet. 25 years of patience dissolved on my tongue. But all I could taste was the bitter realization that my son had learned to hide things in the middle after all, and I was just beginning to understand what he'd been hiding. The evening stretched ahead like a sentence I'd have to serve, surrounded by people who were inventorying my life while pretending to honor my wife's memory. But as I set down my glass and felt their eyes tracking the movement, I made a decision that would change everything. It was time to check the corners. Comment fair if you want the truth to be revealed. The dinner conversation moved around me like water around a stone. Claire talked about her book club. Gerald explained market trends with the authority of a man who'd never worked with his hands. And Patricia offered gentle suggestions about downsizing that weren't suggestions at all. David nodded along, occasionally glancing at me with the careful attention of someone monitoring a situation that might require management. I ate the pot roast, which wasn't Margaret's recipe, despite Claire's claims, and listened to them discuss their plans for Thanksgiving, their thoughts on Christmas, their ideas about family traditions that somehow didn't include asking what I wanted. They spoke about Margaret in past tense, as if she were a character in a story they'd heard, rather than a woman who'd shaped 37 years of my life. She would have loved this, Claire said, touching the pearls again. Margaret always struck me as someone who appreciated bringing families together. Margaret had met Claire exactly 4 times before she died. 4 awkward dinners where my wife had tried to draw out a woman who seemed more interested in photographing the food than eating it. After the 3rd dinner, Margaret had whispered to me while washing dishes. She takes pictures of everything, but doesn't seem to see anything. Now, Claire wore her pearls and spoke about her preferences like she'd inherited them, along with David's last name. Dad's been doing pretty well on his own, David said, cutting into his roast with surgical precision. Though we worry about him in that big house. All those stairs, all that maintenance. It's not that big, I said quietly. Come on, Dad. 4 bedrooms for one person, and that garage workshop. When's the last time you actually built something? The garage workshop where I'd taught him to use a saw, where we'd built the treehouse in the backyard, where Margaret and I had refinished every piece of furniture in the house over the years. The workshop where I still went every morning with my coffee, running my hands over tools that remembered the weight of useful work. I built the deck last spring, I said. You rebuilt the deck, David corrected, because the old one was rotting. That's maintenance, not construction. Gerald leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone of a man about to solve all your problems. Richard, have you given any thought to retirement communities? Not nursing homes. I'm talking about active adult living, golf courses, social activities, people your own age, people my own age. As if 68 made me a relic, unsuited for the company of anyone born after 1955. As if the house Margaret and I had planned, room by room, built board by board, was now too much for me to handle. I like where I am, I said. Of course you do, Patricia said, with the kind of smile you'd give a child who insisted on wearing shorts in winter. It's full of memories, but sometimes change can be healing. Sometimes holding on too tightly keeps us from moving forward. Moving forward, another phrase with sharp edges, designed to make resistance sound like pathology. I looked around the table at 4 people who'd known Margaret, a total of maybe 50 hours between them, explaining to me what would be best for my grief. The thing is, David said, setting down his fork with deliberate care, Claire and I have been talking about the future, about family, about what Mom would have wanted. Claire's hand moved to her stomach in a gesture so quick I almost missed it. Almost. But 40 years in construction teaches you to notice small movements, subtle shifts that signal something structural happening below the surface. Are you pregnant? I asked. Claire's cheeks flushed pink. We were going to wait to announce. That's wonderful news, I said, and meant it. Despite everything, the idea of a grandchild sent warmth through my chest. Margaret had wanted grandchildren so badly, had bought little outfits she'd hidden in the closet just in case. Thank you, Dad. We're excited, but it does change things. David reached for Claire's hand. We've been looking at houses with better school districts, places with more space. This house has plenty of space, Gerald said, gesturing around the great room. For now, but think long term. Think about equity, about leveraging assets. David's voice was gaining confidence, like a salesman hitting his stride. Dad's house has appreciated significantly, the lakefront property especially. The lakefront property. Our cabin on Cedar Lake, 2 hours north, where Margaret and I had spent every summer for 15 years. Where she'd sat on the dock with her morning coffee, watching loons dive for fish. Where she'd planted wildflowers along the path and hung hummingbird feeders from every eave. Where her ashes were scattered, according to her wishes, on a calm Tuesday evening when the water reflected the sky like a mirror. What about the lakefront property? I asked, though I already knew. David and Claire exchanged a look I was becoming familiar with, the glance of co-conspirators checking their timing. Well, you never use it anymore, Claire said. Not since Margaret passed, and it's such a beautiful place. It seems wrong to let it sit empty. I was there last month. For 3 days, David said. Dad, you used to spend entire summers there. Now you go for long weekends and spend most of the time maintaining the place instead of enjoying it. I enjoy maintaining it. But wouldn't it be better if someone could really use it? Someone who could appreciate what Mom built there? What Mom built there. As if Margaret had designed and constructed the cabin single-handedly, as if I hadn't spent every weekend for 2 years laying the foundation, framing the walls, installing the plumbing, as if her vision hadn't been brought to life by my hands, our shared labor, the kind of partnership that builds more than just structures. The point is, Gerald said, leaning back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man reaching his conclusion, you've got assets that could be working for you. Real estate markets are strong. Interest rates are favorable. This could be the perfect time to consolidate, simplify. Consolidate, simplify. Turn a lifetime of work into a number on a balance sheet. Convert memories into investment opportunities. I thought about Margaret's wildflowers, probably blooming unattended along the cabin path. I thought about the dock where we'd sat every evening, watching the sun set over water that held 30 years of summers. And of course, Patricia added, there are tax advantages to consider, estate planning benefits, ways to ensure the family legacy continues in the most efficient manner. Family legacy, efficient manner. They were talking about dismantling my life like it was a business merger, using words that made theft sound like financial planning. I excused myself to use the bathroom, needing a moment away from their careful voices and calculating eyes. In the hallway, I passed a small table covered with framed photographs. David and Claire's wedding, vacation shots from Europe, professional portraits with lighting so perfect they looked like catalog models. Not one picture of Margaret. In our house, Margaret's photos were everywhere. On the mantle, the bookshelf, the refrigerator door. 47 years of birthdays and anniversaries, holidays, and ordinary Tuesday afternoons she'd decided were worth remembering. Our life documented in thousands of moments she'd insisted on capturing because she believed in the importance of evidence. Evidence that we'd been happy. Evidence that we'd been here. When I returned to the dining room, they were sharing dessert. Store-bought tiramisu that Claire presented like she'd made it herself. The conversation had moved to schools, neighborhoods, the logistics of expanding their family while maximizing their opportunities. The great thing about Dad's place, David was saying, is the location. Close to town but still private. Good bones, like he always says. Good bones. The phrase I'd use to describe houses worth saving. Structures built to last. Now my son was using it to appraise the home where he'd grown up, where Margaret had died in our bedroom with his hand in hers, where every room held 3 decades of careful living. Richard, Gerald said, David tells me you built that house yourself. That's remarkable. A real testament to craftsmanship. We built it, I corrected. Margaret and I, together. Of course. Team effort. But the point is, you've got something special there. Something worth preserving for the next generation. The next generation. I looked at Claire, one hand resting on her still flat stomach, Margaret's pearls glowing at her throat. Was this what preservation looked like? Handing over everything Margaret and I had built to people who measured its value in square footage and curb appeal? We should probably head home, I said, standing before anyone could object. Thank you for dinner. Dad, wait. David stood too, his face showing what might have been genuine concern. Are you okay? You seem distant tonight. Distant. As if I were the one who'd changed, who'd suddenly started treating family dinners like business meetings. As if my reluctance to discuss dismantling my life made me the problem. I'm fine, just tired. Why don't you think about what we discussed? Claire said, touching my arm with the same practiced sympathy Patricia had shown earlier. About simplifying, about what would really make you happy. What would really make me happy. I looked around the room one more time, at the granite countertops and designer furniture, at the people who'd spent the evening inventorying my possessions while pretending to honor my wife's memory. What would make me happy was having Margaret back, was having my son be someone who cared more about his father than his portfolio, was living in a world where family meant something more than shared DNA and strategic planning. But since none of that was possible, I'd settle for understanding exactly what I was dealing with. I'll think about it, I said. Driving home through suburban streets that all looked the same in the dark, I kept replaying the evening's conversations, the careful words, the practiced gestures, the way they'd all watched me like shareholders monitoring an aging CEO's performance. Most of all, I thought about the moment David had opened the whiskey box, the way his eyes had assessed its contents like an appraiser evaluating an estate. My house appeared in the headlights like an old friend welcoming me home. Modest compared to David's showcase, but every board and beam chosen by Margaret and me together. I sat in the driveway for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, looking at the front porch where we'd sat 10,000 evenings watching the world slow down. Inside, the silence felt different than it had that morning, not empty, but watchful. I made myself a cup of tea, Margaret's nighttime ritual that I'd inherited along with her favorite mug, and sat at the kitchen table where this day had started. The phone rang just as I was finishing the tea. David's name on the caller ID. Dad, I just wanted to make sure you got home safely. I'm fine. Good. Listen, I know tonight was a lot to process, all the talk about changes, about the future, but I want you to know we're just looking out for you. Looking out for me. The phrase sat heavy in the quiet kitchen. I appreciate the concern, I said. And about the bottle. Thank you for bringing it. It meant a lot to Claire, to all of us. I thought about Claire wearing Margaret's pearls, about Gerald calculating square footage over dinner, about Patricia's gentle suggestions that weren't suggestions. David, I said, can I ask you something? Of course. When did you stop seeing me as your father and start seeing me as a problem to be solved? The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Dad, that's not... It's okay, I said, and realized I meant it. I just wanted to know when it happened, so I could understand. You're not a problem, Dad. You're family. We just want what's best for everyone. Everyone. I hung up and sat in the kitchen quiet, thinking about corners that don't lie and foundations that either hold or they don't. Tomorrow I decided I would start checking some corners of my own, starting with the safe in my study where Margaret had kept our important papers, our wills, our carefully planned future that had suddenly become my carefully planned past. Tomorrow I would find out exactly what they thought they were entitled to, and then I would decide what they actually deserved. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of October day that reminds you winter isn't a suggestion. I'd slept poorly, waking every few hours with fragments of dinner conversation echoing in my head. Gerald's talk of leveraging assets, Patricia's suggestions about downsizing, Claire's careful touches to Margaret's pearls. By 5:30, I gave up on sleep and made coffee, standing at the kitchen window watching frost melt off the truck windshield. The safe sat in the corner of my study behind Margaret's desk, a small fireproof box we'd bought after the Hendersons' house fire took 40 years of their photographs. Margaret had insisted on organizing everything: insurance policies, birth certificates, property deeds, investment statements. If something happens to one of us, she'd said, the other shouldn't have to hunt through shoeboxes for important papers. I'd never imagined I'd be the one doing the hunting. The combination was our wedding date. 6 digits Margaret had made me practice until I could open it in the dark. Inside, manila folders labeled in her careful handwriting: insurance, medical, property, investments, wills. Everything organized with the precision of a woman who'd spent 30 years as a hospital administrator, who believed chaos was a choice and order was a responsibility. I pulled out the property folder first. The house deed, signed by both of us in 1987, clear title with no mortgage. The cabin deed from 1995, bought outright with money we'd saved for 10 years. Every dollar accounted for in Margaret's budget ledgers. 2 properties worth considerable money now, worth enough to change lives, worth enough to make people forget about the love and labor that had built them. The investments folder was thicker than I'd expected. Margaret had been careful with money, conservative but consistent. Retirement accounts that had grown steadily over 40 years. Life insurance policies we'd maintained even when the premiums felt steep. A small portfolio of blue-chip stocks she'd researched like a doctoral dissertation. Not wealthy by Gerald's standards, but comfortable. More than comfortable. The wills folder made my hands shake. 2 identical documents prepared by our lawyer 5 years ago when Margaret's cancer was still treatable, when we thought we were planning for a distant future rather than an immediate one. Standard language, everything to the surviving spouse, then to David upon my death. Simple, clean, the kind of arrangement that assumes families stay families. But at the bottom of the folder was something I'd forgotten. A handwritten note in Margaret's careful script, dated 3 months before she died. Eddie, if anything happens to me, please read the letter I've left for David. It's in my jewelry box, in the compartment behind the ring holder. Some things need to be said while there's still time to say them. But I'm too much of a coward to say them myself. I love you both, but differently than I thought I would. Imparp. I stared at the note until the words blurred. Margaret had never been a coward about anything, had faced her diagnosis with the same methodical courage she'd brought to everything else. If she'd written something for David but hadn't given it to him, there was a reason. In our bedroom, her jewelry box sat on the dresser where I'd left it 3 years ago, untouched except for the pearls David had asked me to bring last night. The box was mahogany, handmade by a local craftsman for our 20th anniversary, with secret compartments Margaret had discovered and delighted in, like a child finding hidden treasure. The letter was where she'd said it would be, behind the ring holder, in a space barely large enough for a folded sheet of paper. My name was written on the outside in Margaret's handwriting, but the letter inside was addressed to David. My darling son, I'm writing this because I don't have the courage to say it to your face, and because I hope you'll read it when you're old enough to understand what it means. Your father is a good man, the best man I've ever known. He built our life one careful decision at a time, never cutting corners, never taking shortcuts, always thinking about what would last. He taught you to work with your hands, to measure twice and cut once, to understand that things worth having require patience and care. But I'm afraid you've learned different lessons from different teachers. I see how you look at our house now, calculating square footage instead of remembering the summer you helped Dad install the hardwood floors. I see how you talk about the cabin, discussing property values instead of the mornings you and I sat on the dock feeding the loons. I know Claire is ambitious, and ambition isn't a sin. But the way she looks at our things, at our life, makes me cold. She doesn't see history. She sees inventory. She doesn't see love. She sees assets. And I'm afraid she's teaching you to see with her eyes instead of your own. Your father will give you everything he has because he loves you. Don't mistake his generosity for weakness, and don't mistake love for obligation. He doesn't owe you our life's work just because you're his son. Inheritance is a gift, not a right. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and he's alone with decisions I should have helped him make. Be the son he deserves, not the son Claire thinks will improve your portfolio. Love and hope, Mom. I read it 3 times, sitting on the edge of our bed, with morning light streaming through windows Margaret had chosen for their eastern exposure. She'd known. Somehow she'd seen what was coming, had tried to leave David a message that might reach him when my words couldn't. But he'd never read it, because I'd never given it to him. 3 years of grief and loneliness had made me selfish, had made me want to keep even her disappointment to myself, rather than share it with the son who'd caused it. The house phone rang downstairs, jarring me back to the present. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my shirt pocket, feeling its weight against my chest like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. Dad? David's voice was brighter this morning, energetic in a way that set my teeth on edge. I hope I'm not calling too early. I've been up for hours. Good. Listen, Claire and I were talking, and we think maybe we moved too fast last night. All that talk about changes and planning. We don't want you to feel pressured. Pressured? As if their careful inventory of my possessions had been accidental. As if Gerald's talk of leveraging assets had been casual conversation. I appreciate that, I said. The thing is, we really do want to help, and we think maybe the best way to start is small. Simple steps that make sense for everyone. Simple steps. I walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garage where I'd taught David to use every tool, where we'd built the bookshelf in his bedroom, where Margaret and I had refinished the dining room table one winter when money was tight, but time was plentiful. What kind of steps? I asked. Well, for instance, the cabin. You said yourself you don't use it much anymore. What if we took care of it for you? Maintenance, utilities, upkeep. Maybe spend some weekends there, keep an eye on things. Keep an eye on things? I thought about Margaret's wildflowers, about the dock where we'd scattered her ashes, about the bedroom where we'd made love for the last time 2 weeks before her diagnosis. That's thoughtful, I said carefully. But I can manage the maintenance. Dad, come on. You're 68 years old. When's the last time you cleaned those gutters, stained the deck, fixed that loose board on the dock? The loose board on the dock. I'd fixed it 3 weeks ago, along with replacing 2 rotted deck planks and resealing the window frames. But David hadn't been there to see it, hadn't been there for any of the careful work that keeps a place alive. Maybe we could start with something even smaller, David continued, like the workshop, all those tools, all that equipment. When's the last time you actually used the table saw? Last Tuesday, when I'd built new shelves for the pantry. But David didn't know that, because David hadn't been in my workshop for 3 years, hadn't asked about my projects or my plans or the quiet satisfaction I found in making useful things with my hands. I use them, I said. For what? Dad, be honest. You're rattling around in that big house with a garage full of tools you never touch, and a cabin you visit once a month. Meanwhile, Claire and I are trying to start a family, trying to build something stable, and we could really use... He stopped himself, but not soon enough. Use what? I asked. Use your help, your guidance, your experience. Your assets, I thought, but didn't say. Your property, your equity, your carefully accumulated wealth that could solve their problems and fund their ambitions. David, I said, can I ask you something else? A pause, wary now. Sure. Did your mother ever give you a letter? Something she wrote before she died? A letter? No, I mean, she left notes sometimes. Grocery lists, reminders about doctor appointments. Why? Because she saw you becoming someone else, I thought. Because she tried to warn you about the difference between inheritance and theft, between love and opportunism. Because she knew Claire was teaching you to see our life as inventory rather than history. No reason, I said. Just wondering. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's letter spread in front of me. Her careful handwriting, her measured words, her hope that David might remember who he'd been before Claire taught him who he could become. Outside, the October wind stripped leaves from the oak tree we'd planted the year David was born. 35 years of growth reduced to bare branches and fallen dreams. I thought about the dinner last night, about Gerald's calculations and Patricia's suggestions, about Claire wearing Margaret's pearls like they had always belonged to her. I thought about David's phone call this morning, his careful words about help and guidance and simple steps that would somehow transfer ownership of my life to people who'd never built anything, never preserved anything, never understood the difference between price and value. And I thought about corners that don't lie, about foundations that either hold or they don't, about the difference between maintaining something and actually using it. By noon, I was sitting in Tom Bradley's law office, the same man who'd drawn up our wills 5 years ago, the same man who'd helped us buy the cabin and refinance the house. Tom was my age, maybe older, with hands that remembered useful work and eyes that had seen enough family disputes to spot trouble before it knocked. "Eddie," he said, shaking my hand with genuine warmth. "Good to see you. How are you holding up?" "Could be better, could be worse." I settled into the chair across from his desk, noting the same framed photos of his grandchildren, the same stack of law books that looked actually read rather than decorative. "Tom, I need to ask you about something, about wills and estates and what happens when families get complicated." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, expression shifting to professional concern. "What kind of complicated?" I told him about the dinner, about David's phone calls, about the careful way they'd discussed my assets like they were already theirs to manage. I didn't mention Margaret's letter. That felt too private, too raw. But I laid out their suggestions about the cabin, the workshop, the gradual transfer of responsibility that sounded like responsibility, but felt like dispossession. Tom listened without interruption, making occasional notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "Eddie, I've seen this before. Adult children who start thinking of their parents as obstacles rather than people. It usually gets worse before it gets better. What can I do about it? Legally, plenty. Your will leaves everything to David, but wills can be changed. Trusts can be established. Assets can be restructured in ways that protect your interests while you're alive. And personally," Tom's expression softened, "that's harder. You can't force someone to love you the way you need to be loved. You can't make them see you as a father instead of a portfolio. But you can make sure they don't mistake your generosity for weakness." I thought about Margaret's letter, about her warning that David might confuse love with obligation, inheritance with entitlement. She'd seen this coming 3 years ago, had tried to prepare me for the day when our son would stop being our son and become someone else's husband, someone else's accomplice. "Tom," I said, "I want to make some changes." He pulled out a fresh legal pad, pen poised. "What kind of changes?" "The kind that makes sure my life stays mine until I decide otherwise." "Now you're talking," he said, and began to write. By the time I left Tom's office, the late afternoon light was slanting gold through the windows of downtown shops closing for the day. I'd signed papers authorizing a complete review of my estate, papers creating a revocable trust that would protect my assets while I lived, Papers that would make it much harder for anyone to pressure me into decisions I didn't want to make. I'd also signed papers I hoped I'd never need to use. Driving home through neighborhoods where families were gathering for dinner, where porch lights were beginning to flicker on against the approaching dark, I thought about Margaret's letter in my shirt pocket, about David's phone call this morning, about the careful way Claire had asked for the pearls last night. They thought they were managing an aging widower who didn't understand his own situation. They thought grief had made me weak, loneliness had made me compliant, that love would make me easy to manipulate. They were about to learn how wrong they were, but first, I had a letter to deliver. The drive to David's house felt longer than it had the night before, every traffic light giving me more time to rehearse words I'd never wanted to say. Margaret's letter sat in my shirt pocket like a weight against my heart, 3 years overdue and heavier for the waiting. The evening air carried the smell of burning leaves and wood smoke, October settling into the bones of the season, with the kind of certainty that comes before everything changes. David's BMW was in the driveway, but Claire's Mercedes was gone. Better that way, I thought. Some conversations needed to happen without an audience, without someone calculating how every word might affect their carefully laid plans. He answered the door in khakis and a polo shirt, the uniform of a man who'd learned to dress for success without ever defining what success actually meant. His smile was automatic, practiced, the same one he'd given me at dinner last night when he thought he was managing my expectations. "Dad, this is a surprise. Everything okay? We need to talk." Something in my tone made his smile flicker. He stepped back, ushering me into the foyer with its marble floors and crystal chandelier, all designed to impress people who'd already decided what they thought of you. "Claire's at her book club," he said, leading me toward the living room. "Can I get you something? Coffee? A drink?" "This won't take long." We sat in chairs that looked expensive and felt uncomfortable, facing each other across a glass coffee table that reflected the overhead lighting like a frozen pond. David leaned forward, hands clasped, wearing the expression of a man preparing to be reasonable about unreasonable requests. "If this is about this morning's call," he began, "I want you to know, your mother left you a letter." The words stopped him mid-sentence. His mouth opened, closed, opened again without sound. For a moment, he looked like the boy who used to run to me when thunderstorms scared him, vulnerable and young and genuinely surprised. "A letter?" I pulled it from my pocket, still folded, still carrying the weight of 3 years' silence. "She wrote it 3 months before she died, left it in her jewelry box with instructions for me to give it to you." "Why didn't you?" "Because I was selfish, because I thought if you didn't read it, maybe things would stay the same between us. Maybe you'd still be the son she remembered instead of—" I gestured around the room at the carefully curated perfection that felt more like a showroom than a home. "Instead of what?" "Read the letter." He took it with hands that trembled slightly, unfolding it with the careful reverence you'd show a museum piece. I watched his face as he read, watching the progression from curiosity to understanding, to something that might have been shame. When he finished, he folded it again, slowly, precisely, like he was trying to make it small enough to forget. "She wrote this?" "Every word." He stared at the letter in his hands. "She thought I was... She saw me as... She saw you clearly. The question is whether you can see yourself the same way." The silence stretched between us, filled with the tick of an expensive clock and the distant sound of traffic. David set the letter on the coffee table like it might burn him, then picked it up again, reading it once more. "Dad, I know how this looks. Last night, this morning's call. But it's not what you think." "What do I think?" "That we're trying to take advantage of you. That we see dollar signs instead of family." His voice was gaining strength, conviction. "But that's not it. We're worried about you. This big house all alone, no one to help if something happens." "Something like what?" "Like a fall, like a heart attack, like any of the things that happen to men your age who insist on living like they're still 40. Men your age. The phrase landed like a slap, reducing 68 years of life to a statistic, a demographic, a problem requiring management by younger, supposedly wiser hands. "David, when did you start thinking of me as an old man instead of your father? You are my father. That's why? When did you start calculating the square footage of my grief?" He flinched. "That's not fair. Isn't it? You asked about the cabin's property value before you asked how I was doing. You discussed leveraging my assets over dinner while wearing your mother's pearls like costume jewelry. Claire wanted to feel connected to what? To money? To status? To the idea of inheritance she thinks she's entitled to? David stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out on his perfectly manicured lawn. You don't understand the pressure we're under. The mortgage on this place, Claire's student loans, the baby coming. We're trying to build something stable, something lasting. With my money, with family resources, with smart planning that benefits everyone. Family resources, smart planning. The language of business applied to blood, the vocabulary of acquisition disguised as affection. I thought about Margaret's letter, about her warning that Claire was teaching him to see with her eyes instead of his own. David, turn around, look at me. He did, reluctantly, his face flushed with something between anger and embarrassment. I want you to remember something, I said. Remember the summer you were 16 when we built the deck at the cabin? You complained about every step. Mixing concrete was too hard. Measuring lumber was boring. Staining the boards was tedious. But when we finished, you stood on that deck for 10 minutes just looking at the lake, and you said it was the best thing you'd ever built. I remember. Do you? Because the boy who said that understood something the man in front of me has forgotten. He understood the difference between making something and taking something. Between earning something and inheriting something. David's jaw tightened. This isn't about earning or taking. This is about family taking care of family. No, I said, standing to face him. This is about you and Claire deciding I'm too old to manage my own life, too sentimental to make practical decisions, too attached to things that should belong to you. That's not... I went to see Tom Bradley today. The words stopped him cold. Tom had handled David's college loan paperwork, had been there when we bought his first car, had drawn up the will that left everything to him. David knew exactly what a visit to Tom Bradley meant. Dad, don't do anything rash. Rash? Like giving away my cabin to people who see it as a real estate investment? Like turning over my workshop to someone who hasn't touched a tool in 3 years? Like letting myself be managed into a retirement community so you can liquidate my life? Nobody's talking about liquidating. Gerald is, Patricia is, Claire is, and now you are too, even if you're using prettier words. David sank back into his chair, the letter still in his hands. For a moment, he looked smaller, younger, like the boy who used to help me sand furniture in the garage while Margaret made sandwiches and called us in for lunch. Dad, I don't want to fight with you. Then stop giving me things to fight about. What do you want from me? The question hung in the air between us, simple and impossible. What I wanted was my son back, the one who'd cared more about building something together than acquiring something alone. What I wanted was Margaret, who'd understood that love wasn't a transaction and family wasn't a business plan. What I wanted was to turn back time to when inheritance meant wisdom passed down rather than wealth passed over. I want you to read that letter every day until you remember who you used to be, I said. I want you to tell Claire that my things aren't her things, that Margaret's jewelry isn't her jewelry, that my generosity isn't her entitlement. And if I don't, then you'll find out what Tom Bradley and I discussed today. I left him sitting in his expensive chair, holding his mother's letter like evidence in a trial he'd already lost. Driving home through neighborhoods where porch lights glowed warm against the evening dark, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years: clarity. Margaret had been right. David was confusing love with obligation, inheritance with entitlement. But more than that, he was confusing his father with someone who could be managed, manipulated, and ultimately controlled by people who'd never understood the difference between price and value. At home, I sat in my study with the documents Tom had prepared, reading through trusts and codicils and carefully worded protections that would keep my life in my hands until I decided otherwise. The papers felt substantial, important, like the foundation of something that would last. But first, I had a phone call to make. Marcus Rivera answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the warm authority of a man who'd spent 40 years building things that mattered. Marcus and I had served together in Vietnam, had learned construction together afterward, had stood beside each other at more funerals than either of us wanted to count. If I needed someone who understood the difference between giving and being taken from, Marcus was that man. Eddie, How's retirement treating you? Could be better. Marcus, I need a favor, a big one. Name it. I need to make some changes to my house. Security system, new locks, maybe some renovations that would make it difficult for anyone else to move in. A pause, thinking. What kind of difficulties are we talking about? The kind that send a message, the kind that make it clear who owns what and who makes the decisions. Ah, Marcus's voice carried understanding, and something that might have been approval. Family troubles? Something like that? When do you want to start? Tomorrow, if you can manage it. Eddie, you know I'd do anything for you, but what you're really asking for, that's not about locks and alarms. That's about setting boundaries with people who don't respect boundaries. I know. You sure about this? Once you start down this road, there's no pretending things are the same. I thought about David in his expensive chair, about Claire wearing Margaret's pearls, about Gerald calculating square footage over dinner while discussing my wife's memory. I thought about 3 years of careful manipulation disguised as concern, 3 years of being treated like a problem requiring management rather than a father deserving respect. Marcus, I said, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Then we start tomorrow, and Eddie, it's going to be a pleasure. After we hung up, I walked through my house, really walked through it, seeing every room Margaret and I had planned, every piece of furniture we'd chosen together, every photograph and book and carefully preserved reminder of a life built one decision at a time. The house felt different now, not like a museum of the past, but like a fortress of the present, a place worth defending. In the bedroom, I opened Margaret's jewelry box one more time, looking at the empty space where her pearls had lived, the vacant compartment where her letter had waited 3 years to be delivered. Tomorrow, Claire would probably call to thank me for letting her wear them, to explain how meaningful it had been to feel connected to Margaret's memory. I'd let her keep them, not because she deserved them, but because Margaret's real legacy wasn't jewelry. It wasn't property or assets or things that could be appraised and liquidated. Her real legacy was the understanding that love required boundaries, that family required respect, that inheritance was a gift freely given rather than a debt automatically owed. David would learn that lesson, one way or another. And if Claire couldn't learn it, she'd at least learn to live with the consequences of never trying. The October wind rattled the windows, stripping more leaves from the oak tree, preparing the world for winter. Inside, I sat in Margaret's chair with her letter to David spread across my lap, reading her words one more time before folding them away. Some things need to be said while there's still time to say them. But sometimes, when words aren't enough, actions have to speak louder than love ever could. Tomorrow, my actions would start speaking, and my family would start listening, whether they wanted to or not. Marcus arrived at 7:30 the next morning in his white pickup truck, the bed loaded with equipment I couldn't identify but recognized as serious. He'd brought his son, Jake, a quiet man in his 30s who'd inherited his father's steady hands and careful eyes. They unloaded boxes of electronic components, spools of wire, and tools that looked like they belonged in a space program rather than a residential security installation. "Coffee's on," I said, leading them through the kitchen. "Hope you don't mind the early start." "Early start's the best kind," Marcus said, accepting a mug with the satisfaction of a man who'd been drinking coffee since before dawn. "Jake and I looked over your property last night, drove by around 10, did a walking survey this morning before you were up. Hope you don't mind. Find anything interesting? Tire tracks in your driveway that aren't from your truck. Fresh ones, maybe 2 days old. Someone's been sitting out there, watching." Jake nodded, pulling out a tablet and swiping through photos. "BMW sedan, based on the tread pattern. Parked at the end of your driveway for maybe an hour, based on the oil drip pattern. David's car." I thought about his phone call yesterday morning, his careful questions about my plans, his suggestion that I might be too old to manage the cabin maintenance. While we'd been talking, someone had been watching my house, taking notes, making plans of their own. "What else?" I asked. Marcus set down his coffee, his expression shifting to business mode. "Your windows are original, single-pane glass. Easy to break, easier to jimmy. Your front door lock is 30 years old. Good quality for its time, but technology's moved on. Your garage door opener uses a code that could be cracked by a determined teenager with a laptop. In other words, anyone who wanted to get in could do it. Anyone with basic skills and bad intentions? Yeah." Jake pulled up another photo on his tablet. But that's the easy part to fix. The harder question is what you want the system to accomplish. Basic security, or something more comprehensive. Something more comprehensive. I looked around my kitchen, seeing it with new eyes, not just as the room where Margaret and I had shared 10,000 meals, but as a space that needed protecting from people who thought they had a right to inventory its contents. Tell me about comprehensive. Marcus grinned, the expression of a craftsman about to explain his favorite project. Smart locks that can be controlled remotely, changed instantly, and monitored constantly. Security cameras with night vision, motion detection, and cloud storage that can't be tampered with locally. Motion sensors that can distinguish between a raccoon and a human, between you and someone who doesn't belong here. And environmental controls that can make life very uncomfortable for uninvited guests. Temperature settings that respond to occupancy sensors. Lighting systems that can simulate presence or create confusion. Sound systems that can play recorded messages or other audio designed to encourage departure. Jake looked up from his tablet. The goal is to create a house that only works properly for people who belong here. Everyone else gets the impression that maybe they should be somewhere else. I thought about David's suggestions about the cabin, about Claire's careful inventory of my possessions, about Gerald's calculations of square footage and property values. They were treating my home like an asset to be evaluated rather than a life to be respected. Perhaps it was time they understood the difference. How long would this take? 2 days for the basic installation, Marcus said. Another day for testing and fine-tuning. But Eddie, once we do this, there's no pretending it's just about security. This sends a message. What kind of message? That you're not as helpless as they think, that you're not as trusting as they hoped, that if they want what's yours, they're going to have to work for it in ways they never expected. I walked to the window, looking out at the oak tree where David used to climb, at the driveway where he'd learned to ride his bike, at the yard where Margaret had planted the garden that still bloomed every spring because I tended it with the same care she'd shown. This was my home, built with my hands and her vision, filled with 40 years of careful living. No one had the right to walk through it like potential buyers at an estate sale. Start with comprehensive, I said. We can always scale back if it's too much. Now you're talking. Marcus pulled out his own tablet, stylus poised. Let's walk through the house, room by room. I want to understand how you live, what matters most, what needs the highest level of protection. We spent the next hour touring my home like generals planning a defense. Marcus made notes about sight lines and access points, while Jake measured distances and tested wireless signals. They photographed every window, every door, every potential vulnerability, treating my house with the respect of professionals who understood that security wasn't just about keeping people out, it was about keeping control in. The study should be the command center, Marcus decided, gesturing toward Margaret's desk. Central location, good views of the driveway and backyard, already has the electrical outlets we'll need. You'll be able to monitor everything from here, control access remotely, review recorded footage. What about the garage? Motion sensors, cameras with infrared capability, and some special features Jake's been developing for his more discerning clients. Jake looked up from his measurements. I've been working on systems for people who need their property to defend itself. Nothing dangerous, nothing illegal, just very effective at discouraging unwanted visitors. Such as audio systems that can play specific frequencies known to cause discomfort, lighting patterns that disorient without causing permanent harm, environmental controls that make spaces unpleasant to occupy without proper authorization. I thought about David's casual dismissal of my workshop, his assumption that I no longer used tools I'd mastered before he was born. Perhaps it was time he learned that old hands could still build new surprises. Do it, I said. They worked through the morning with the focused efficiency of men who'd built careers on getting details right the first time. Jake installed sensors while Marcus ran cable, both of them moving through my house with the careful respect of guests who understood they were handling someone else's treasures. They asked before moving furniture, cleaned up their debris without being reminded, treated my home like it mattered. Around noon, Claire's Mercedes pulled into the driveway. "Expecting company?" Marcus asked, glancing out the window. "Unfortunately." Claire stepped out of her car wearing a white sundress and Margaret's pearls, carrying herself with the confident bearing of a woman who assumed she'd be welcome anywhere. She knocked on the front door with the quick, impatient rhythm of someone accustomed to immediate attention. I opened the door before she could knock again. "Richard, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Her eyes went past me to the equipment scattered through the hallway, the cables snaking along the baseboards, the obvious signs of serious work in progress. "Oh my, what's all this? Home improvements. How exciting. Mind if I come in? I brought you something." She held up a small gift bag, the kind you'd use for a birthday present or a thank you gesture. I stepped back, letting her into the foyer, watching her eyes catalog the changes even as she maintained her bright smile. "I wanted to thank you for letting me wear these last night," she said, touching the pearls at her throat. "They made me feel so connected to Margaret's memory, so much a part of the family. A part of the family." I watched her gaze move from the security equipment to Marcus, who'd appeared in the hallway with a drill in his hand and an expression that suggested he'd dealt with people like Claire before. "This is Marcus Rivera," I said, "an old friend. Marcus, my daughter-in-law, Claire." Marcus nodded politely but didn't offer his hand. Claire's smile faltered slightly at the implied distance, the suggestion that not everyone would automatically find her charming. "What kind of improvements are you making?" she asked, directing the question to me, but watching Marcus for clues. "Security upgrades. Seems like a good time to modernize a few things." "Security?" Her voice carried just the right note of concern. "Has something happened? Have you felt unsafe?" "Just being careful. You can never be too careful these days." Claire opened the gift bag, pulling out a small frame photograph, David and her at their wedding, all smiles and promises. The kind of professional portrait that costs more than most people's monthly rent. "I thought you might like this for your study, a reminder that you're not alone, that you have family who care about you." I took the photograph, noting its weight, its expensive frame, the careful way it had been matted and mounted. But mostly I noticed what it didn't show: Margaret, who had been too sick to attend the wedding. Me, relegated to the background of a ceremony that felt more like a business merger than a celebration of love. "That's thoughtful," I said. "David told me you two had a good talk yesterday, that you're working through some things together." She paused, watching my face for reaction. "He's so grateful that you're being open to new possibilities, to changes that might benefit everyone." New possibilities. Changes that might benefit everyone. The careful language of someone who'd learned to make demands sound like suggestions, to frame manipulation as mutual benefit. "Claire," I said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you look at this house, what do you see?" She glanced around the foyer, at the hardwood floors Margaret and I had installed ourselves, at the family photographs covering 40 years of life, at the grandfather clock that had marked time for our marriage. "I see a beautiful home with so much history, so much potential." Potential for what? For continuing to be a gathering place for family, for creating new memories alongside the old ones, for being loved and cared for by people who understand its value. People who understand its value. I thought about Gerald's questions about square footage, about David's casual dismissal of my workshop, about the careful way they'd inventoried my possessions while pretending to honor Margaret's memory. "And what do you think that value is?" Claire's smile became more careful, more calculated. "Oh, I couldn't put a number on it. Some things are beyond price." "No," I said. "I think you could put a number on it. I think you already have." The smile faltered completely now. Behind me I could hear Marcus working, the steady sound of a man who knew exactly what he was building and why. "Richard, I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm saying it directly. You and David have appraised my life, calculated the value of my possessions, and made plans for my property without bothering to ask what I want. You're wearing my wife's pearls like they belong to you. You're asking about my workshop like it's already yours. You're discussing my cabin like I'm too old to use it myself." Claire straightened, some of her careful charm dropping away, to reveal something harder underneath. "David is your son. We're family. Families support each other. Families plan together. Families respect boundaries," I said. "Families ask before they take. Families don't treat their elders like obstacles to be managed or assets to be liquidated. The silence stretched between us, filled with the sound of Jake's drill from the kitchen, the distant hum of Marcus's voice as he explained something technical to his son, normal sounds of work being done by people who understood that some things were worth protecting. "I should go," Claire said finally, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Thank you for the visit and for clarifying your position." "Thank you for the photograph," I said, though I had no intention of displaying it anywhere Margaret might have seen it. I watched her Mercedes disappear down the street, then returned to find Marcus standing in the hallway with a satisfied expression. "Interesting conversation," he said. "You heard?" "Hard not to. Woman's got a voice that carries." He grinned. "Good thing we're almost finished with the audio monitoring system. Conversations like that tend to be worth recording." "Marcus? Eddie, I've been doing this for 40 years. I know the difference between security and paranoia, between protection and persecution. What you've got here is a family that's forgotten the difference between inheritance and theft." He was right, and we both knew it. The work continued through the afternoon, cables hidden behind baseboards, sensors mounted in corners where they'd be invisible but effective, cameras positioned to capture every approach to the house. By evening, my home had been transformed into something that looked exactly the same but functioned entirely differently. "Final test," Jake said, handing me a smartphone with a custom app installed. "Everything can be controlled from this. Locks, lights, cameras, environmental systems. You can monitor the house from anywhere, change access codes instantly, review footage, and activate special features when necessary." "Special features?" Marcus grinned. "Let's just say anyone who tries to enter without permission will find the experience memorably unpleasant." That evening, after Marcus and Jake had left, I sat in my study testing the new system. Every room appeared on the smartphone screen, every entrance was monitored, every window was protected. The house that Margaret and I had built with love and labor was now defended with technology and determination. But more than that, it was defended with something my family had underestimated: the resolve of a man who'd learned the difference between giving and being taken from, between generosity and weakness, between love and manipulation. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Dad, Claire said you seemed upset today. Maybe we should talk." I typed back, "Maybe you should read your mother's letter again." Outside, October wind rattled the windows and stripped more leaves from the oak tree. Inside, motion sensors tracked my movement, cameras recorded empty rooms, and a security system waited for visitors who might not understand that some invitations had been permanently revoked. Tomorrow, I'd make some phone calls. To the bank, to make sure no one else could access my accounts. To the insurance company, to update my beneficiaries. To Tom Bradley, to finalize the trust documents that would protect my assets from people who confused inheritance with entitlement. But tonight, I sat in Margaret's chair reading her letter one more time, feeling her presence in every carefully chosen word, every warning she'd tried to leave for our son. She'd seen this coming 3 years ago. Now it was time to see it through. The call came at 8:15 the next morning, just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee and reviewing the security footage from overnight. Nothing unusual: a raccoon investigating the garbage cans, a neighbor's cat crossing the yard, the steady passage of a Tuesday morning in suburbia. But David's voice on the phone carried an edge I hadn't heard before, something sharper than concern and colder than disappointment. "Dad, we need to talk, today." "Good morning to you too." "Don't. Just don't." His breathing was rapid, angry. "Claire told me about yesterday, about what you said to her, about the accusations you made." "I didn't make accusations. I made observations. You told my pregnant wife that she was trying to steal from you. You made her feel unwelcome in your house, unwelcome in this family. Unwelcome in this family. As if Claire's comfort was more important than my autonomy. As if her feelings mattered more than my property rights. As if being pregnant gave her claim to possessions she'd never earned. David, your wife wore your mother's pearls to dinner and talked about honoring her memory with people who barely knew Margaret. She walked through my house yesterday cataloging improvements and asking about security like she was planning to move in. If that made her feel unwelcome, maybe she should examine why. She was trying to connect with Mom's memory. She was trying to connect with Mom's jewelry. There's a difference. The silence that followed was thick with the kind of anger that comes from hearing truth you don't want to acknowledge. When David spoke again, his voice was lower, more controlled, but somehow more dangerous. "Dad, I think you're losing perspective. I think grief and isolation are making you paranoid, making you see threats where there's only family trying to help." Paranoid. The word was carefully chosen, designed to make me question my own judgment, to suggest that age and loneliness had clouded my thinking. It was the first step in a process I recognized from watching other families tear themselves apart, paint the elder as incompetent, establish a pattern of poor judgment, create justification for intervention by people who knew better. David, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am not paranoid. I am not losing perspective. I am not too old to understand what's happening to me. Then explain the security system. Explain why you're suddenly treating your own family like criminals. I'm treating my property like property. I'm treating my possessions like possessions. I'm treating my life like my life, not like a shared asset that everyone gets to vote on. That's not... It is exactly that. You and Claire and her parents spent an entire evening discussing my assets like they were yours to manage. You've made suggestions about my cabin, my workshop, my house, my future, without ever asking what I actually want. Because we're worried about you. No, you're worried about inheriting efficiently. You're worried about maximizing assets. You're worried about making sure nothing valuable gets wasted on an old man who doesn't understand his own best interests. Another silence, longer this time. I could hear voices in the background, Claire's urgent whisper, someone else responding with careful calculation. They were having a conference, making decisions about how to handle the stubborn old man who wasn't cooperating with their plans. "Dad, I'm coming over. We're going to sit down and work this out like adults." "Are you bringing Claire?" "Of course I'm bringing Claire. She's my wife." "Then you're not welcome." The words came out flat, final, carrying the weight of 40 years' experience in making decisions that mattered. David's sharp intake of breath told me he'd heard them clearly. "What did you just say?" "I said you're not welcome, not with her, not while she's wearing your mother's jewelry and treating my home like a real estate opportunity." "Dad, you can't." "I can. It's my house, my property, my decision about who enters and who doesn't. We're family." "Then act like it. Read your mother's letter again. Think about what she was trying to tell you. And when you're ready to be my son instead of Claire's accomplice, call me." I hung up and immediately activated the enhanced security protocols Marcus had installed. Every entrance was now monitored, every approach would be recorded. Every attempt at unauthorized entry would trigger responses designed to discourage persistence. My home had become a fortress, but more than that, it had become a statement. This far and no further. The phone rang again immediately. David's number. I let it go to voicemail. It rang 4 more times in the next hour. Each time, I let the machine answer while I sat in my study, monitoring the security feeds and waiting for the inevitable escalation. Because I knew David well enough to understand that being told no would only strengthen his conviction that I was incompetent, that intervention was necessary, that love required overriding my expressed wishes for my own good. At 10:30, Claire's Mercedes appeared on the driveway camera, followed immediately by David's BMW. They sat in their cars for several minutes, clearly discussing strategy before emerging together. Claire had changed clothes since yesterday. Gone was the casual sundress, replaced by something more businesslike, more serious. She'd also removed Margaret's pearls, a small concession that somehow made her seem more calculating rather than less. They approached the front door together, David's hand on Claire's back in a gesture that might have been protective or proprietary. The motion sensors tracked their movement, the cameras recorded their approach, and the audio pickups caught their conversation as they reached the porch. "Let me do the talking," David was saying. "He's more likely to listen to me." "Are you sure? Maybe I should apologize for yesterday, smooth things over." "No, he's looking for reasons to exclude you. Don't give him any." They knocked, not the casual rap of family, but the firm, official knock of people conducting business. I opened the door before they could knock again, keeping the chain engaged so they could see me but not enter. "Dad, open the door. We need to talk." "We can talk like this?" "This is ridiculous. We're your family." "Then prove it. Send Claire home and come back by yourself." Claire stepped forward, her face arranged in an expression of wounded sincerity. "Richard, I don't understand what I've done to offend you. I've tried so hard to honor Margaret's memory, to be the daughter she never had." "Stop!" The word came out harder than I'd intended, carrying 40 years of protective instinct for the woman she was invoking. "Don't you dare use my wife's name to justify whatever this is." "Richard, please, I'm carrying your grandchild. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "It means you're pregnant. It doesn't mean you own my house." David's face was flushing now, anger and frustration mixing with something that might have been genuine hurt. "Dad, what's happened to you? When did you become this suspicious, this cruel?" "I became careful. There's a difference." "This isn't careful. This is paranoid. Standing behind a chained door talking to your own son like he's a stranger, that's not the behavior of a man thinking clearly." Not thinking clearly. There it was again, the careful suggestion that my judgment was compromised, that my decisions couldn't be trusted, that intervention might be necessary for my own protection. "David, I'm going to ask you one more time. Are you here as my son or as Claire's husband?" "Both. That's what family means. We're all connected. We're all responsible for each other." "Then you've answered my question." I closed the door and activated the additional security measures Marcus had installed. Through the monitors, I watched them stand on my porch for several minutes, David gesticulating angrily, while Claire maintained her wounded expression. They knocked again, more insistently this time, then moved to the windows, trying to peer inside, checking for unlocked entry points. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Dad, this has gone far enough. Open the door, or we're calling someone who can help." Someone who can help. The threat was carefully veiled but unmistakable. Social services, wellness checks, medical interventions, legal proceedings designed to establish that I was no longer competent to make my own decisions. The progressive escalation of a family that had decided love required control. I typed back, "Call whoever you want. I'm exactly where I belong." Through the cameras, I watched them return to their cars, but instead of leaving, they made phone calls. Long conversations filled with gestures and obvious frustration. David's call lasted 15 minutes. Claire's took longer, and I could see her consulting notes, reading from what looked like a prepared list. They were implementing a plan. Whatever they'd discussed before coming here, whatever strategies they'd developed for handling my resistance, they were putting them into motion now. 20 minutes later, Gerald's silver Lexus pulled into the driveway. He emerged wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, carrying himself with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to solving other people's problems through superior resources and professional connections. The three of them huddled near the cars, voices low but animated, clearly coordinating their next move. Gerald approached the door alone, his knock measured and authoritative. "Richard, it's Gerald Morse. I think we need to have a conversation." I opened the door, chain still engaged. "About what?" "About family, about responsibility, about making sure everyone's interests are protected during what I understand has been a difficult time for you." "My interests are protected just fine." "Are they? Because from where I stand, it looks like grief and isolation might be affecting your judgment, making you see conflict where there's only concern, threats where there's only love." The language was smoother than David's, more practiced, carrying the authority of a man who'd spent decades convincing people to do things they didn't want to do. But underneath the professional polish was the same basic message. You're not thinking clearly, and we know better. "Gerald, I appreciate your concern, but this is between me and my son. Actually, it's not. Not when it affects my daughter, my future grandchild, my family's welfare. Not when it involves assets that could impact multiple generations. Assets that could impact multiple generations." There it was, finally spoken plainly. The understanding that my property wasn't really mine, that my decisions affected their portfolio, that my autonomy was secondary to their financial planning. My assets are mine to manage as I see fit. Of course they are. No one's questioning your right to make decisions. We're questioning whether you're making them with all the information you need, with proper advice, with consideration for everyone who will be affected. I have all the information I need. Do you? Have you considered the tax implications of your current estate planning, the liability issues of maintaining multiple properties, The medical realities of aging in place without proper support systems? Each question was designed to highlight my supposed limitations, to establish that I was operating without crucial knowledge that only they could provide. The tactics of a salesman who'd learned to make customers feel ignorant before offering them enlightenment. Gerald, let me be very clear about something. I built my house with my own hands. I earned every dollar in my bank account. I bought my properties with money I saved over 40 years of work. I don't need your advice, your information, or your concern about how my decisions affect your family's financial planning. His expression shifted slightly, the professional smile giving way to something colder and more calculating. Richard, I'm trying to be diplomatic here, but the fact is you're exhibiting behavior that concerns people who care about you. Paranoid thinking, social isolation, resistance to reasonable suggestions from family members. Whose suggestions? Claire's, David's, mine. People who have experience with these situations, who understand the complexities you might not be seeing. What complexities? The complexity of managing assets during periods of emotional distress. The complexity of maintaining properties that require more attention than one person can provide. The complexity of family relationships when one member becomes difficult to work with. Difficult to work with. The phrase was carefully chosen, designed to pathologize my resistance, to frame my refusal to cooperate as evidence of diminished capacity rather than rational self-protection. Gerald, I said, I want you to go back to your car, drive away from my property, and never come back. I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation. I understand it perfectly. You and your family have decided I'm too old to manage my own life. You've made plans for my property without consulting me. You've treated my home like an asset to be liquidated, and my judgment like a problem to be solved. Now you're standing on my porch threatening me with professional intervention, because I won't cooperate with my own dispossession. No one's threatening anyone. We're trying to help. Then help by leaving. I closed the door and watched through the monitors as Gerald returned to his family conference. The conversation that followed was more animated, more urgent, filled with gestures that suggested escalation and frustration. Claire appeared to be crying, or performing crying. It was hard to tell through the camera feed. David was pacing, his phone pressed to his ear again. After another 15 minutes, all three cars left together, a convoy heading back toward whatever war room they'd established to plan their campaign for my welfare. I sat in my study reviewing the recorded footage, saving the most relevant conversations to cloud storage that couldn't be accessed or deleted by anyone else. Evidence of their true motivations, their coordinated planning, their willingness to use medical and legal intervention to override my expressed wishes. The phone rang again an hour later. This time it wasn't David or Claire. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was professional, official. Mr. Dalton, this is Dr. Rebecca Martinez from Mercy General Hospital. I understand there may be some concerns about your welfare. I'm calling to schedule a wellness check. A wellness check. They had moved faster than I'd expected, but not faster than I'd prepared for. This was the next phase, medical intervention designed to establish incompetence, to create a paper trail that would justify future legal action. Doctor, I'm fine. I don't need a wellness check. I understand that's how you feel, Mr. Dalton, but your family has expressed some concerns about recent changes in your behavior, isolating yourself, making unusual financial decisions, expressing paranoid thoughts about family members. These can be signs of conditions that affect judgment. What conditions? Early-stage dementia, depression-related cognitive decline, medication interactions. Nothing dramatic, nothing that can't be managed with proper care. But we do need to establish a baseline. Make sure you're getting the support you need. Support I need. Management with proper care. The language of medical authority applied to what was fundamentally a property dispute. Clinical terminology used to pathologize my refusal to surrender control of my own life. Doctor, who called you? I can't discuss that specifically, but I can tell you that multiple family members have expressed similar concerns. This isn't a single complaint. This is a pattern of observations from people who know you well. Multiple family members, a pattern of observations. They'd coordinated their story, aligned their concerns, created the appearance of widespread worry about my mental state, professional manipulation disguised as family intervention. When do you want to do this wellness check? Tomorrow morning would be ideal. Nothing invasive, just a conversation and some basic cognitive assessments. We can do it at your home if that's more comfortable. At my home, where they could observe my living conditions, take photographs of my security modifications, document anything that might support their narrative of declining competence. Doctor, I'll call you back. Mr. Dalton, I really think I'll call you back. I hung up and immediately called Tom Bradley. Tom, they've escalated. Medical intervention, wellness checks, the whole playbook. How fast can you get to my office? 20 minutes. Make it 15. And Eddie, bring every recording, every document, every piece of evidence you've collected. We're going to war. I gathered my files, activated the house's complete security lockdown, and headed for my truck. In the rearview mirror, my home looked exactly as it had for 40 years. Modest, well-maintained. The kind of place where families should live in peace. But peace, I'd learned, was something you had to fight for. And the fight was just beginning. The afternoon sun slanted through Tom's office windows as I spread security footage, recorded conversations, and documented evidence across his conference table. He listened without interruption while I played audio of Gerald's threats, Claire's manipulations, David's carefully veiled suggestions about my competence. When I finished, Tom leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a lawyer who'd just been handed a winning case. Eddie, they've made a tactical error. They've documented their motivations too clearly, moved too fast, left too many tracks. What kind of tracks? The pattern of behavior suggests premeditation, coordinated family intervention based on financial rather than medical motives. Any competency evaluation will have to address whether their concerns are genuine or whether they're using medical authority to achieve property objectives. Tom pulled out a legal pad, pen poised. Here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to establish your competence proactively. Medical evaluation by doctors you choose, cognitive testing by certified professionals, financial review by independent accountants. We'll create a record that shows you're making rational decisions based on legitimate concerns. And second, we're going to challenge their standing. Adult children don't automatically have the right to intervene in their parents' lives. They have to demonstrate genuine incapacity, not just disagreement with decisions they don't like. What about the wellness check? You're going to cooperate fully. You're going to document everything. And you're going to let them establish that you're exactly as competent as you appear to be. Tom stood, walking to his window that looked out on the courthouse where Margaret and I had been married 43 years ago. Eddie, I've seen this before. Families that confuse inheritance with entitlement, love with control, they think because they're family, they can override your autonomy for your own good. Can they? Not if you're willing to fight. Not if you're willing to prove that resistance isn't pathology. It's self-preservation. I left Tom's office with a briefcase full of legal protections and a plan that felt like armor. Tomorrow, I would submit to their wellness check, their cognitive testing, their professional evaluation of my mental state. I would answer their questions, complete their assessments, and demonstrate conclusively that my judgment was sound. And then, I would show them what a sound mind could accomplish when it decided to stop being cooperative. The war was escalating, but I'd been building defenses longer than they'd been planning attacks. And I'd learned something they didn't understand. The difference between giving up and giving in was often just a matter of choosing your battles carefully. Tomorrow, they'd find out what battle they'd actually picked. Dr. Martinez arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, accompanied by a social worker named Janet Chen, whose gentle demeanor couldn't quite mask the clipboard full of evaluation forms. I welcomed them into my living room, the same room where Margaret and I had hosted countless family gatherings, where David had opened Christmas presents, where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries in happier times. "Thank you for agreeing to this, Mr. Dalton," Dr. Martinez said, settling into Margaret's favorite chair, with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to being invited into other people's problems. "I know these situations can feel intrusive, but we're just here to make sure you're getting the support you need." "I appreciate your concern," I said, meaning it. These women were professionals doing their jobs, not conspirators in David's campaign. The fact that they'd been manipulated into this visit didn't make them enemies. The evaluation took 2 hours, cognitive tests that asked me to remember word lists, solve puzzles, identify patterns, questions about my daily routine, my social connections, my ability to manage finances and maintain my home, physical assessments that confirmed what I already knew, that at 68, I was healthier than many men 20 years younger. Janet Chin took notes throughout, documenting my responses with the thoroughness of someone who understood that paperwork could determine lives. When she asked about my family relationships, I answered honestly but carefully, explaining that I'd had some disagreements with my son about my future without elaborating on the financial motivations behind his concern. "Mr. Dalton," Dr. Martinez said as we finished the formal assessments, "I have to ask about the security system. Your family mentioned that you've recently installed extensive monitoring equipment, changed your locks, made modifications that seem unusual for someone in your situation. What situation is that? A widowed man living alone, dealing with grief, potentially feeling vulnerable or isolated." I walked to the window, looking out at the oak tree where David had built his first treehouse under my guidance, where Margaret had hung bird feeders every winter, where 40 years of seasons had marked the passage of our life together. "Doctor, let me ask you something. If you owned something valuable, your home, your possessions, your life's work, and people started making plans for those things without consulting you, what would you do?" "I'd want to protect them. Even if those people were family?" She paused, considering. "Especially if they were family. Family disputes can be the most painful because the expectations are highest." "That's exactly right. I installed security because I need to protect what's mine. Not from strangers, but from people who think love gives them the right to make decisions for me." Janet Chen looked up from her notes. "Mr. Dalton, your son and daughter-in-law seem genuinely concerned about your welfare. They mentioned that you've become suspicious, withdrawn, resistant to help. Have you spoken with them directly?" "Briefly, yes, as part of our standard procedure." I pulled out my phone, accessing the security app Marcus had installed. "I'd like to show you something." The footage from yesterday's confrontation played on the screen. David and Claire discussing strategy in the driveway. Gerald's calculated approach to my door. Their coordinated phone calls afterward. The audio was clear enough to hear Gerald's comments about assets and liability, Claire's references to leveraging family resources. Dr. Martinez and Janet Chen watched in silence, their expressions shifting from professional skepticism to genuine concern. "Mr. Dalton," Dr. Martinez said carefully, "this footage suggests a level of family conflict that goes beyond normal caregiving concerns. It suggests that my resistance to their plans isn't paranoia, it's rational self-protection." Janet Chen set down her pen. "Have you considered that they might genuinely believe they are acting in your best interests?" "I'm sure they do, but their definition of my best interests involves transferring control of my property to them. That's not caregiving, that's acquisition." The two women exchanged glances, the kind of professional communication that happens when a situation turns out to be more complicated than the initial report suggested. "Mr. Dalton," Dr. Martinez said, "based on our evaluation today, I see no evidence of cognitive decline, no signs of depression or anxiety that would impair your judgment, no indications that you're unable to care for yourself or manage your affairs." "What about the family's concerns?" "Family concerns are important, but they don't override individual autonomy. You have the right to make decisions about your life, even if those decisions aren't what your family would prefer." Janet Chen nodded. "My report will reflect that you're living independently, maintaining your property appropriately, and making rational decisions about your welfare. The security modifications appear to be a reasonable response to specific family pressures rather than evidence of paranoid thinking." After they left, I sat in my study reviewing the morning's events. The wellness check had accomplished exactly what Tom Bradley had predicted. It had established my competence while documenting the true nature of my family's concerns. But more importantly, it had given me something I hadn't expected: validation from neutral professionals that my perceptions were accurate. The phone rang at noon. David's number. "Dad, I heard the evaluation went well." "It did. Dr. Martinez found no evidence of cognitive decline or impaired judgment." That's good news." His voice carried disappointment rather than relief, the tone of someone whose hopes had been dashed rather than confirmed. But Dad, just because you're mentally competent doesn't mean you're making the best decisions. According to whom? According to people who care about you. According to family who can see the bigger picture. The bigger picture. I thought about Margaret's letter, about her warning that David was learning to see with Claire's eyes instead of his own, to value acquisition over relationship, inheritance over integrity. David, I want you to understand something. This morning's evaluation established that I'm competent to make my own decisions. Any future attempts to override those decisions, medical, legal, or otherwise, will be documented as harassment rather than concern. Dad, you're talking like we're enemies. Are we? The question hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of 40 years' love and 3 days' betrayal. When David finally answered, his voice was quiet, defeated. I don't know anymore. Then let me help you figure it out. Come to dinner Sunday, just you, no Claire, no in-laws, no agenda about my property or my future. Come as my son, and we'll see if that's still possible. And if I bring Claire, then you'll confirm that you've chosen your wife's family over your father's autonomy, and I'll act accordingly. I hung up before he could respond, then called Tom Bradley to report the morning's success. The wellness check had not only cleared me of incompetence, it had documented the coordinated nature of my family's intervention, creating a record that would protect me from future attempts at medical or legal override. That evening, I sat on my porch watching the sun set through October trees that were dropping their leaves like old regrets. The security system hummed quietly around me, cameras recording the peaceful suburban evening, motion sensors tracking the passage of squirrels and stray cats, technology and vigilance protecting the life Margaret and I had built together. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Sunday dinner, just me, 6 p.m. I typed back, I'll make pot roast, Mom's recipe. For the first time in weeks, I felt something approaching hope. Not for reconciliation. Too much had been said, too much had been revealed for things to ever return to what they'd been. But hope that my son might remember who he'd been before Claire taught him who he could become. Before inheritance became more important than integrity. Before property became more valuable than relationship. Sunday would tell the story. Either David would come alone, ready to remember that some things couldn't be appraised or acquired, or he would confirm that he'd chosen his new family's ambitions over his father's dignity. Either way, I'd be ready. The house was secure, the documents were filed, the boundaries were established. I'd spent 40 years building something worth protecting, and I'd learned that protection sometimes required saying no to people you loved. Margaret's letter lay folded in my shirt pocket. Her words about love and obligation, inheritance and entitlement, feeling more relevant with each passing day. She'd seen this coming, had tried to prepare me for the choice David would eventually have to make. Now that choice was 3 days away, and I knew exactly what each possible outcome would mean. Sunday dinner would determine whether I still had a son, or whether I simply had an adversary who happened to share my DNA. The autumn wind carried the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves, the scent of seasons changing whether you were ready or not. Inside my secure house, surrounded by 40 years of memories and 3 days of hard-won wisdom, I began planning a meal that might be the last I'd ever share with my son, or the first we'd share as equals. If you like this ending, type like.